What is education? By education, I'm talking about after high school. You're being educated, shaped, formed in high school, but is education over after high school? No. So what's education after that? Let's make a sketch. Call this higher education. Well, for a lot of people, education is training, preparation for a job. You're going to go into business. There are things that is useful to know about business, and you study that. Given the job you choose, you may have to train for a job and go to a university to do it. But just because that is so, does that mean that is what education is? Education used to mean something different from job training. In 1637, the French philosopher Descartes said, "To hold converse with those of other ages and to travel are almost the same thing." Education, then, is a kind of intellectual tourism. Let's travel back to those other times and see what people used to say. Descartes is right. This is very much like travel. Let's go to other parts of the world and see what it's like there. What are we looking for? Well, we'll see when we get there. We're not looking for anything, as a matter of fact, but maybe you'll find something useful. And that is what Descartes had in mind. He said, "It is useful to know something about the manners of different nations, that we may be enabled to form a more correct judgment regarding our own." You might find something very useful in, say, China. That's where paper and noodles and gunpowder came from. So for some people, education is looking at how different people have thought in different times and different places to find what it is useful to know. Not about their job, but generally. You study ancient Greek democracy and you find something really applicable to the present day. But look, when was the last time you heard someone say about what they were learning in university, "Great, really useful to know this"? When did you see someone come back from a trip and start doing something that they saw people do in China or in Brazil? You go on a trip to Asia, to South America, or back to the past. And what people usually say is, "Neat. It's interesting." It's not useful in any way to know about Greek democracy. The people who found something useful in Greek democracy lived centuries ago and brought democracy to England. Right? This is already done. Universities like to tell you. And do you buy this? That if you get an education with us, your life will be changed. Changed how? This is an advertising ploy. And like a lot of advertising, not actually a lie, but rather a very easy promise to keep. Is your life changed when you go to India? Yeah, you will say. Right? Won't you? Will you really say, "I saw all those people and their culture and how they live and what their hardships are, and I'm just the same"? Of course not. You will say you have been changed by this experience because you have this experience in you. You did something. You traveled. And you have something, an experience. An unforgettable experience, you say. And that's what a university, I don't want to say does, but can do. Because, let's be honest, how many people go to university and say they had an unforgettable experience? They will talk about their trip to India like that, but ask them about their courses, and usually they're going to say, "They're okay. My poli-sci course is pretty neat." And so, did university change their life? Well, sure, in just that way. They got something. What? Ideas about things. Did university change their life? Sure, they got something out of it. I do, I have, They did something, they have something. What do they have? The stuff they got out of those courses they liked. Was it something useful? No, not really. It was interesting. They enjoyed studying that stuff. They had an experience. And as the years pass, they gradually forget that poli-sci stuff. They gradually forget India. So for a lot of people, education, which is looking at how people have thought in different ages, is exposure to what is interesting. It's not useful particularly to know what they are learning, but it's interesting. They're not saying, great, really valuable to know this. They're saying, neat, really interesting. What else is higher education? Have I left anything out? That's about it, what you see here. That is, this is what education is today, in our time. And our time goes back in its thinking about education. Our time goes back to the time of Descartes in the 17th century. Was there anything before this? You notice quite a span of time here, which we could certainly push back further. If we were to go back to Old Testament times, to the age of the book of Proverbs or Deuteronomy, was there any conception of higher education in this earlier period? Now, I appreciate that you might be inclined to say, who cares? Who cares? Because that is all old-fashioned knowledge, or that is some understanding of learning that has very little relevance to today's world. I love that expression, today's world, because the world changes. It's perfectly okay if you have such thoughts, because these are the thoughts of our time. And by the way, when did we start talking like this? Who cares? That is outmoded knowledge, no relevance to today. It's interesting to ask this because there is an answer. We started doing this in the modern period, in this period. Voltaire announces, I quote, "The prodigious superiority of our age over the ancient times. Some people may wish to deny any such superiority, but this dispute between the ancients and the moderns has been decided," he says, "in favor of modern thought." Voltaire then boasts that there is not one of the ancient philosophers whose works are now made use of for the instruction of youth in any of the enlightened nations. The philosophers that youth read at university are all modern because, he says, that old stuff had to be replaced. Of course, Voltaire was right that there was such a thing as the old tradition before the modern world turned away from it. There is an entire tradition that not only precedes the modern world, but continued alongside it into the modern world. And this tradition has an understanding of education that is not represented anywhere in this diagram we drew of what higher education is today. And that's easy to show because this is what education used to be about. About what? Everything. Does that mean people used to learn all knowledge? No, that's not the idea of the truth about all things. It was the essential knowledge, outside and around these three circles, of what life and work and play is for. The ancient understanding of the truth was not everything a person could know, it was everything a person needs to know. Needs to know to do what? Needs for what purpose? Not needs to do a job, be a banker, a lawyer, a teacher, that's job training. Not needs to make improvements to society, that's utility, the sphere of useful things. That's not unimportant. Not needs to help fill life with meaningful experiences, that's intellectual tourism, learning about things because it's interesting. Against Descartes and his idea of conversing with past thinkers as a kind of travel for the sake of utility, Thomas Aquinas said, "The purpose of the study of philosophy," to pick one thing we study at Augustine College, "is not to learn what others have thought, but to learn how the truth of things stands." Say you have conversations with past thinkers. What is the truth? When your conversation is over, that question still remains. That is what we need to know. Isn't there anything that we need to know that is outside these three circles? Homer and Plato and Augustine, Dante, Calvin, and Pascal said yes. But even Nietzsche said yes. Nietzsche said it is fairly obvious to any living human being, any person who is not just one of the herd, going along with everyone else like cows, that you want to be transformed into that kind of person who is the true brother or sister of all that life is for. Nietzsche wasn't thinking that it's this, but the language is very similar. You are living for something, whether you know it or not. The idea of life gives meaning to your entire existence, and you are not yet in harmony with this, Nietzsche said. If you are a human being, you want more from education than a job, usefulness, or interesting stuff on your mental shelf. You want to live and become a genuine advocate of life. And Nietzsche said that modern education dupes you into accepting less. It sells you a conception of knowledge that is completely against this desire in you. Nietzsche wrote, "Modern man drags around with him a huge quantity of indigestible stones of knowledge, which then, as in the fairy tale, can sometimes be heard rumbling about inside him. And in this rumbling there is betrayed the most characteristic quality of modern man, the remarkable antithesis between an interior which fails to correspond to any exterior and an exterior which fails to correspond to any interior, an antithesis unknown to the peoples of earlier times." What is he saying here? Notice that last remark about earlier times. Nietzsche was a professor of classics, not philosophy. He studied ancient Greece. At all earlier times, he says, the focus of an education was to transform yourself and be a unified person whose outward self, the one presented to others, matches their inward self, because they have become a real self, an integrated self. In education, you want to be transformed by what you take in. You want to take in what transforms you into a truly living creature, not one floating through life, making money, or collecting intellectual knickknacks. But modern knowledge, he says, is indigestible. It just sits in you like stones, which is why you hear it rumbling around. You can't digest it and make it into yourself, because it's not that kind of knowledge. Modern man sinks into his own interior depths, which here means into the accumulated lumber of what he has learned, but which has no outward effect, of instruction which does not become life. Nietzsche said this about the modern university in 1874. 150 years later, people have yet to wake up to this fact. But Nietzsche also said, most people simply do just go along with the crowd, unthinkingly. What is higher education for? That we have trouble going beyond this, that we're even satisfied with this, tells us that we are complacent children of the modern age. When I finished drawing these circles, I asked you, what else is higher education? Have I left anything out? I counted to 7 to give you time to think. Almost an awkward silence. Did anything come to your mind when I did that? If nothing came to your mind, and above all, if this did not come to your mind, that simply tells you what culture has raised you, what culture has conditioned your thinking about what education might be at this stage of your life. Now, it couldn't be clear to you what I mean by an education that teaches people the truth about all things. Let me say a little more about it. The idea of the truth that you see here was just this. Everything that a person needs to know to live life as it should be lived. Needs for what purpose? To live. Nietzsche was not talking through his hat. Now, when I say that, I can expect any card-carrying modern person to say, come on, I'm living right now. You don't need to know anything to live. A baby is born ignorant, and what does it do? It lives. Now, that answer would be considered by Aristotle or Augustine or Calvin or C.S. Lewis a very ignorant answer. Makes a lot of sense, so not at all a stupid answer, but uninformed. And an uninformed person simply needs to be informed, educated. Is it true that this baby is living, that you are living now? Don't you, in fact, want to live more? Not live longer, but live more deeply. We have right here in this claim about life, this idea about life, that you don't need to know anything to live. An example of what might be lacking in your understanding of all things, of life. And what you don't know might be stopping you from living more deeply, in the way you really want to. Let's look at this for just a minute. When a person says you don't need to know anything to live, what they mean by living is biological life. They're talking about the body. But are you just a body? If you think that you are living because your heart is beating, your blood is flowing, you are breathing, etc., then you must think of yourself as just a kind of organic machine. But this is you insofar as you have a body. And that is not the full extent of you. All the figures I have just mentioned, from Plato to Calvin to Lewis, were agreed that we also have a soul, and that a person who simply took care of his body, but not his soul, was not living even by half, because he or she is not 50% body, 50% soul, but a soul and body human being. An animal, yes, but with a very unusual kind of soul. But I won't go into that. Modern people know more about the body than the soul. They might not be able to say a single thing about the soul. How can they live then? But let me ask you something about the body. What does it mean to take care of your body? What is taking care of your body? Isn't it giving your body what it needs? And to do that, don't you have to establish what it needs? What kind of exercise is needed to be fit? What kind of food is needed to be healthy? And so on. I think you will say yes. But look, what we have just established is that even for biological life, we have to know something, learn about the needs of our body so that we can take care of it. Does a tiger need to learn about this stuff? About cholesterol? No, but we do. Why? That's a very interesting question, about which the people I have shown you had a lot to say. But that's another topic. So look at what we have established, just thinking about this. Just for a minute. Even to live just as a biological creature, we need to learn about the parts that make us up so that we can take care of them and live. Well, it's the same with our other side, the soul. The soul can be abused, just like the body. And when you abuse the soul, you don't die physically, that is. Physical death is caused by abuse of the body, but you do die or begin to die in spirit. And that is the man's soul, by the way. That little naked figure being carried off here by a demon. All the thinkers I have just mentioned, I'm going to stop saying this because I would be repeating this again and again, they are all in agreement about these things. They all agree that the soul can be abused, and that when you abuse it, don't take care of it, you wither up inside and you become fearful and weak and dangerous to others. If you have not learned what the soul needs and then fed it, taken care of it as you take care of your body when you go for a run or eat what you should. Democritus, back before Socrates, I didn't have room to squeeze him in, will say, your life, no less than your body, may suffer disease. So what have we just talked about? When I said that higher education for 2,300 years, that's the span of time we're looking at in that timeline. When I said that higher education used to be instruction in the truth about life, instruction in all those things that a person needs to know, to live life, to be a living person, not an ailing person, a dying person, not a person who is a mere shadow of a human being. In what we have just been talking about, you see one tiny piece of that learning, a learning that can free people from the illusion that they are just bodies, just animals who live naturally, who are born alive and fully themselves and just live. Human beings are not like that. The purpose of higher education for 2.5 millennia was precisely to equip people with this kind of knowledge that we need. To give people that part of their food and nourishment that would allow them to exist, to live more fully than a baby who is born and lives biologically. Why stay in that state? And how do you get beyond it? Joseph Addison in the 18th century writes, until we are formed, until we are human, we are embryos struggling towards birth. He was writing for young people. He said, writing for the benefit of those who are still in the deplorable state of non-existence and whom I most earnestly entreat to come into the world. And you must appreciate this. There is a school for birth. That is not some bizarre idea. It is a perfectly natural idea. You can become a banker. You can be born as a banker if you learn what a banker is supposed to do. Not a bad banker, but a proper one. In banker school, that is what you learn, what a good banker is, the qualities of a good banker. You can also become a human being if you are not so foolish as to think no knowledge is required for this. You just are a human being. If you learn what a human being is supposed to do, that is what the qualities of a good human being are. A good tree bears fruit. A good banker has certain key qualities. A good human being has others. And so that is what you learn at being school, let's call it that. Not I have, but I am. If you can find such a school and get into one, if you have teachers who belong to this tradition and understand your need, who know something about the true fruits of learning, because they were educated by men who knew. They went to this school. At this school, you learn what a good human being is so that you can be one, so that you can exist. There is a school for birth that will help you to be. I am is the real game, the basis of everything. How interesting that God referred to himself that way. Who are you who says, I have? I have a job, I have experiences, India, the study of literature or art, but have put forth nothing that you need to live. You are a tree with no leaves, no branches. Who are you who says, I do, I work, I earn, I travel, I read, but don't do what the creature you are was created to do? You are a tree with leaves and branches, but no fruit. By all means, do and have, because we are made for this, but not until you are, and then do and have so as to be, to live. Is this an understanding of higher education? Yes, it is. And how much do you think there is to learn at such a school? Well, this college has allowed itself only 8 months in which to try to offer some part of this foundation. 8 months is a very small portion of your education, but nothing could be more important. Education in the ancient mold has to do with you and what you are and become. It begins by shattering the deep, self-flattering myth that virtually every modern person has bought into. Why, this modern person asks, would I need to be educated about myself? I know about myself. But why would we imagine that we know about ourselves just because we are ourselves? People look at Socrates' famous statement, know thyself, gnothi seoton, and what do they think? You may suppose that you understand this, but taken on its own, it is a very ambiguous commandment. What is this self? We hear this motto, and we like it, and we get the tattoo. But what do we think this means? We hear thyself and think me, an individual. We hear the word self and instantly think it means delve into the mystery of the unique individual you. Discover your true desires, the desires of you, the individual. And who else but you can teach you about that? How does a Christian think? The ancient world did not think that way, nor was it against you, the individual. In fact, we were taught by people like Augustine that to fulfill your true desires, the desires of you, the individual, you would have to understand what you are, what kind of thing you are. To know yourself is primarily to know what God made in you, not what the accidental experiences of your life have created. To know yourself is primarily to know what God has done in making you a human being, created by God through Adam and Eve, a human being who has all the loves that God put into the soul of this creature, since it is your soul that draws you to things, said Plato, Augustine, and so on. Socrates heard this expression as, know what it is to be a human being. Know the difference between men and beasts, between men and gods. You cannot become yourself and realize your truest desires, the desires that are truly yours, not the desires of the fake you that universities and advertisers are saying is you. You cannot realize your truest desires until you know yourself. What did Augustine want from higher education? He wrote, I desire to know God and the soul. Nothing more, asks his interlocutor. Nothing whatever. There is something else you might know, but there is nothing else you need to know. What must I say to finish? There's one thing I have not discussed, but that I must in order to allay some suspicions that I suspect some of you have. I certainly would have them sitting in your place. Where is Christ in this vision of higher education? In the 1620s, Jan Comenius wrote a scathing satire of human folly that he titled The Labyrinth of the World. That is, the world is a place in which you can get lost. You can lose your soul. In the first part of the book, he skewers human manners left and right. In the book, a traveler wanders through a city of 17th century Europe, surveying the madness of everyday life, that is, life without God. Comenius is a contemporary of Descartes, and higher education comes off badly. The pilgrim goes to a school where they study Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Luther, and there is a great confusion as to what is true. The chapter ends as follows, this chapter on higher education. A great dispute began, for one man maintained this opinion and another that one, and having thus settled nothing, the professors dispersed and returned to their quarrels, and this grieved me unto tears. What has happened? Somehow people have ceased to know. The modern age has begun. In the final part of the book, however, the pilgrim escapes the labyrinth of the world and reaches the paradise of the heart. He is now in the company of Christ, and there the book ends. And with what knowledge will the pilgrim replace the confusion he had found in a godless world? With what will we replace the absurdities of higher education in our godless world? Comenius answers like this. Toward the end of the book, he gives Jesus these words. Neither the world, nor your guides, nor Solomon could teach you anything, nor enrich you, nor satisfy you, nor fulfill the desires of your heart. For that which you sought was not to be found in them. But I shall teach you everything, enrich you, and satisfy you. Did Comenius mean that the Proverbs of Solomon are empty? Did Comenius mean that as an individual, within the relationship that I myself have with Christ, all the necessary knowledge would be given to me without studying, without reading, without having any conversations with my fellow man, past or present, without any attention to the social and moral thought of the church over the centuries, with no teacher but Christ, who will simply place the right answers straight into my head? Studying and books, is that all just the fallen world? I somehow doubt it. The church, we are told in the scriptures, is the body of Christ. We are the organs of that body, or the cells of organs. That is, we are joined to one another and work together in the body with each other in order to be ourselves. The blood feeds the limbs. It's not just the head, Christ, that feeds the limbs. Individual cells linked only to Christ, that is no image of a body. It was the body of Christ, the church, that created the university in the first place. So as to lose people in the labyrinth of the world? No, as a place that would transmit a true understanding of where we are, so we would make our way out of the maze and live, so we would learn exactly what Christ is teaching. How do Christians think about higher education? Unfortunately, their thinking is very often the world's. There is no job for education to do but prepare us for the workplace and entertain the mind. College is a fun time when I can study whatever I want. But the Christian who becomes convinced by arguments such as I have made that true education has to do with the soul, as Augustine said, this Christian will often say, and Jesus is the physician of my soul. He will teach me all. I don't need a school when I have the Son of God. Well, is this Christian right? Is he smarter than Augustine? This college was named after Augustine because it has accepted Augustine's understanding of higher education. In this passage from the Confessions, he reflects on his studies as a youth prior to his conversion. "What did it profit me," he writes, "that all the books I could procure of the so-called liberal arts, I, the vile slave of vile affections, read by myself and understood? For I had my back to the light, and my face to the things enlightened. Whence my face, with which I discerned the things enlightened, was not itself enlightened. Whatever was written either on rhetoric or logic, music and arithmetic, by myself without much difficulty, or any instructor, I understood, as you know, O Lord my God, because quickness of understanding is your gift. Yet I did not sacrifice to you." What was the use of this learning, he asks? What is the use of any learning, even if it is genuine knowledge, to a person who stands with his back to the light, who is blind to the source of all light? In this dark condition, what use was learning? "It served not to my use, but to my perdition," he writes. Perdition is lostness. And while he did not have Christ, books just helped him be more lost. But when Augustine is finally converted and turns to the light to face Christ, this is the interesting thing for us, he does not throw away every truth that he had found and get rid of his books. Since what is true is precisely, he tells us in the passage we just saw, what is enlightened by Christ himself, the truth. Christ does teach all things worthy of being learned. Let every true and good Christian understand, Augustine writes, that where truth may be found, it belongs to his master. How do Christians think about higher education? Very badly, and not as Christians, if they suppose that they do not have to act in concert with other believers and do not have to make any effort to acquire the truth, and do not have to involve themselves with true things in books, in study, since Christ will simply do their thinking for them, as if they were helpless babies. That is not how Christians think. That is the thinking of a person who is falling under the sway of Christ's opponent. The way of the world has been clarified for us in the Scriptures. We who have accepted Christ are being tempted as he was tempted, lured away from him into other hands. Instead of being encouraged by this world to think like Christians, we have been given other views, but we should reject them. Tourism should go on the back burner. Job training can wait 8 months. We have work to do as Christians, and it is labor in the truth, which we ourselves need to study before we suppose that we could pass it on to anyone in this culture. We are ignorant even about ourselves. How do Christians think? They believe what they should reject. They believe that how to think like a Christian follows naturally from being a Christian, just as they think that how to be a human being follows naturally from being one. They imagine that how to think like a Christian is something a Christian will naturally pick up. Everything essential you will just pick up as time goes by. That is a myth. They also believe that you know best what you should study. Nobody else can tell you what kind of schooling you should do. But if you accept what I have said here, it should be clear to you that this too is a myth. In the church, in the body of Christ, we are saved from ourselves, not remanded into our own custody, abandoned and alone. What should you study? What school should you go to? Only you know, whatever you want, says the devil. And all too often Christians also believe that you can learn what you need to learn without a teacher. Everything essential you can just pick up for yourself. Just buy some books and read them. Because you are a Christian, it will all be clear to you. Who is saying this to you? You are not Augustine, one of the great minds of the medieval age, who said that by myself, without much difficulty or any instructor, I understood. It is the devil who is painting this rosy picture of us. Why, do you think? It is the devil who says, you don't need to study, you already know all the essential things. But he knows very well that you do not. Just ask yourself this. Do you care about justice in society? Does this matter to you? Do you know how to be just? That is, how to treat other people as they deserve. This is a virtue named in the Scriptures. It is a synonym of righteousness. Do you know how to be just? Of course you do, says the devil. All we need is love, we are told, which is to say, everybody knows what love is, just do it. But that's not true. What love is not obvious, said Christians for centuries. Beatles-style Christians are a different breed. How can you love someone, as Jesus calls us to do, and not treat them as you ought? Love is justice, not a feeling. In reality, there is a lot to learn here. Justice is not what feels just, because there is no such feeling. But justice can be found by thinking, if you learn how to do this thinking. It is something to study. Isn't there a lot to think about? To be just, for example, you have to have the right motives. What are these? Also, a great deal of attention was paid in the Christian tradition to whether it is right to treat everyone the same. The sensible idea that it is not discrimination to treat different things differently was very carefully explored. And Christians were taught that the right thing to do had to be tested. You yourself could figure out the right way to treat a person by coming up with the proper good reasons, but you would need to do this in company with others who are better people than you, because this can be difficult. This is knowledge that may be acquired and must be acquired because it is a commandment, said the Christian tradition, to love each other. In the Christian past, there was study of these things because they matter. Augustine or Aquinas never thought that the grace of God, which made you a Christian, instantly turned you into the equal of Christ. You don't become the equal of Christ by learning either. But without learning, how will you know what to do with the power Christ gives you? Christ gives us power and incentive to think, to see things illumined in his light, so as eventually to think as Jesus thought. A Christian should learn to think as a Christian. And you are fortunate in having some opportunity to do this, because there are few such institutions around. By all means, go on to university, but use it to live your life, and for heaven's sake, and I mean that literally, don't live your life as a consumer, treating education as a kind of mental entertainment, a holiday from work that you deserve. We are called to serve. At Augustine College, we study the history of ideas, some of the same subjects Augustine studied: philosophy, logic, rhetoric, and some of the same thinkers he did, and other subjects: literature, art, the thought of Christians in the life of the church. But we are attentive to the words of Augustine. It served not to my use, but to my perdition. We would reverse that. There are things we must come to learn so as to know how to live. And we study this in theology, in literature, in art, so that we know who we are and what is in us that needs to be fed, and what feeds it, and what does not, none of which can be answered by ourselves on our own, and none of which can be answered except in the light of Christ in the gospel. But if I were to try to put everything I have been saying to you into a single sentence, it would be a question. The question I have for any young person, Christian or not, is, where are you going to go to learn the most important things? Where are you going to go to learn the most important things? Will you learn them just as a matter of living? That is, nothing needs to be studied, it will all just come by itself. Are the most important things the basic knowledge of a Christian? That there is a God, that Christ died for our sins, things that you can say in under a minute. That is, you know this already. Nothing needs to be studied. But Christians used to believe that we were called to be Christ-like, and that this involves learning. Christians used to read so as to understand how to live in the light of Christ. That is important, to become the kind of being God created us to be, which means becoming Christ-like. And since we have minds, it means being Christ-like in mind too. Christians studied and perpetuated what was true about life. They wrote books and gave sermons so that people would learn this, since this is the teaching of wisdom, which is what the mind really needs, the true food of the true life. Our tradition of learning lasted a long time. I don't have room on the screen to go back and count in the wisdom of Solomon, the Psalms, the Torah. At this college, we try to give you the essentials from this tradition in 8 months. How do you do that? Well, we do our best. I teach philosophy, which is one of my loves. I love the beautiful figure of philosophy mentioned by the philosopher Boethius, who lived in the 5th century. The beauty of philosophy is that philosophy asks, what do you really need to know? And does all she can to supply it, what the ancient tradition called wisdom. I teach at this college because philosophy as wisdom is welcome here. But this understanding of thinking as understanding our highest purpose and learning how to attain it, has been ridiculed at the university, truly driven out of the university to be replaced by something entirely different. Go to a university and take a course in philosophy. Will you be taught wisdom? You might learn some, but that isn't what drives the university. I teach here because that is what we do. Knowledge about philosophy is dust, but the church, the body of Christ, is about food and life. William Law in the 18th century writes, "What excuse, therefore, can be made for that learning, which, robbing us of the true fruits of the tree of life, leaves us nothing to feed upon but the dry dust of words?" Thank you for your patience.